I'm Allison Alexy, and we're so grateful that you're able to join us. Extending the series of new book talks that began in the fall, today the presentation will start with a conversation between Dr. Alana Gershon and myself, and then open to questions and comments from the audience. As you can see, your microphone and camera are muted now, but please use the Q&A function to ask questions or share thoughts throughout the event. This event has lots of time for discussion, and we're really looking forward to hearing your ideas and reactions. Next week, Thursday, February 18th, please join us for At the Crossroads of Peace and Coexistence, documenting the lives of Japanese wives of Korean repatriates, given by Mr. Jong-wook Kim, who's a freelance documentary photographer. The presentation will be delivered in Korean language with an English translation, and to accommodate everyone involved, the presentation will actually be at 7 p.m. Ann Arbor time instead of our regular noon lecture. So this looks wonderful. Please consider joining us for this as well. There are many more wonderful events in this series, so please check out our CJS events page or the UM page and all sorts of various social media for more information about upcoming events. Today, I'm very grateful to have this opportunity to present and talk with you all about my book, Intimate Disconnections. This feels like an incredibly fitting venue, not just because CGS has been one of my intellectual homes while I was writing it, but also because I received generous funding from CJS to give me some time off from teaching while I was finishing the book. And it makes me really, really happy to be able to share the book with you all and express my gratitude to CGS, and also a large number of people in the audience or people that I owe a great deal of gratitude to as well. I'm similarly grateful to be able to speak with Dr. Alana Gershon, the Ruth N. Halls Professor of Anthropology at Indiana University. She's also helped me revise and improve the book over many years. Her research on intimacy and neoliberalism has helped me situate my own work, and I want to make sure you know about two of her excellent books. The Breakup 2.0, it's a bit of a show and tell here at the beginning. The Breakup 2.0, about breaking up over social media, and Down and Out in the New Economy, about how neoliberalism is shaping and reshaping the American labor market. By way of a brief introduction, let me say that I'm an assistant professor here at Michigan in two departments, Asian languages and cultures and women and gender studies. I'm a cultural anthropologist, and as you'll hear today, my research focuses on gender, family, intimacy, and law in contemporary Japan. Alana, can I ask you to introduce yourself if you want and start the discussion?
Well, you've done such a beautiful job of kind of introducing me and introducing this center in your own work. So thank you very much. I thought we should start, I wanted to start talking by explaining to the audience that, Allison, your work is really quite seminal in a kind of surprising way, which is anthropology has been fixated on kinship for decades and decades, and yet we don't do much around divorce at all. We don't think about disconnection in relationships. And so, with the exception of one or two texts, you had a wide open field to start defining how to approach this. And so I was wondering if you could begin by orienting us a little bit to the book and talk a little bit about what it is like to write with such intellectual openness ahead of you.
Thank you so much for that question. You're right. As you know, based on your own work about breakups and disconnections, it's almost funny that anthropologists who, for basically the existence of our discipline, we really haven't, which has been focused a lot on kinship and religion and a few other things, but divorce and breakups hasn't really been a focus. And so in some ways that made it really fun to try to think about this, right? And to give me an opportunity to link this project with the vast anthropological literature on kinship. I should maybe say for people in the audience who aren't anthropologists, which is great, I'm glad you're here. One of the things that anthropologists are doing a lot when we focus on kinship, but one of the things that we're doing when we're focusing on kinship is looking at the way that people organize their lives, right? So because family relationships, kin relationships are something that very many of us use on a daily basis. We organize our lives through these. We think about when you pay attention to how much money moves through families, for instance, let alone emotional connection, let alone all these other things, right? So in terms of kinship, yes, I did come at the book in this kind of maybe a little bit of a typical anthropological fashion. Divorce, the book is about divorce in contemporary Japan. I started the fieldwork in 2005 and I've been back and forth sort of doing updates. This was a moment when divorce was pretty much at the highest rate it was throughout the post-war period. So if anyone in the audience is interested in learning about the divorce rate earlier in Japan, specifically in the 1890s, I'm happy to talk about it. But in this moment, I happened to start doing the field work. A lot of people were either getting divorced or were thinking about divorce, kind of fantasizing about it, or they were really worried that they were about to get left, that they were about to get, dumped, for lack of a better word. And so it was something that people in Japan were really talking about, maybe more so than you might expect. And even beyond the divorce rate, like the increasing divorce rate, one of the things that I was noticing, and frankly, that a lot of people just wanted to tell me about, was that divorce had suddenly changed in an important way. And in the 70s and 80s, divorce was usually stereotypically recognized as something that men wanted and that women tried to refuse. They knew that it wasn't good for them, that the stigma was too heavy. And then starting in maybe the late 90s, and just as I was starting to do field work, suddenly like everyone seemed sure that divorce was something that women wanted and that men were trying to refuse. And so that's part of the reason I got interested in the project, and picking that apart is part of what I'm trying to do in the book. So beyond that, what I'm ultimately arguing in the book is that thinking about what makes a good marriage, what makes a bad marriage, what kind of marriage you might want to leave, how you leave it if you do, became something that a lot of people were really thinking about. People of all ages across Japan in different ways, of course. There's a huge amount of variety here. But what I'm arguing in the book is that as people were having those conversations internally with themselves, with their friends, with their family members, maybe with their spouse, they were choosing between, they were trying to figure out what kinds of relationships would be good for them and what kinds of relationships would bring risks that they no longer wanted to have. And I'm arguing in the book that they're kind of balancing between or choosing between three different kinds of relationships or models for relationships. So what we might call in this case sort of traditional Japanese understandings of what a marriage should look like, which is that the spouses sort of become so close that it's like itai, it's almost like one body. They just know each other. They don't even have to communicate with each other. They just sort of become one person. What scholars call companionate romance, a model of companionate romance. And this is the model that probably many people in this conversation subscribe to, right? So that your spouse should be your best friend. Ideally, you're friends with the person you're married to. And then in the third instance, neoliberal models for personhood in general. So the suggestion that being independent is necessarily always a good thing or a better thing for most of us. And so what I found in this moment, in this particular moment, sort of extended moment in Japan from about 2005 to about 2012, that people were trying to decide how they want to relate to each other picking and choosing from these different models. So I think that's a brief overview. Does that answer your question, Alana?
No, that's a lovely answer. Yes. So thank you. And I as you're talking, I'm realizing that it might have been very disconcerting to get to Japan for the first time, knowing that you wanted to study divorce. You could go onto the Tokyo subway and think of every third person here could have something really relevant to tell me, but you can't just go up to people and say, hey, I'm studying divorce. Want to tell me about your thoughts about this? And so I'm wondering, how did you get started? Like you don't have the kind of the luxury that anthropologists used to have, which is you go to a village and then people have to put up with you and you write a lot of field notes.
Yeah, that's a great question. I should say probably people also were very generous and put up with me in this
Yes.
instance as well. So let's be clear about that. I was certainly annoying, I'm sure, in all sorts of different ways. But to your question, which is a really good one, and I should say too, this kind of question is something that I think a lot of people are really interested in. So I'm glad you asked it. And by that I mean, well, so I'll answer your question, then I'll explain a little bit more. So yeah, you can't, I guess you could go up to people on the subway, but it's probably not going to be super productive. So really I started in two ways. I have been going back and forth to Japan since 1993. So I have friends there, people I've known for a long time. And, they always help me and put up with me, to use the key phrase, and introduce me. They're like, oh yeah, I have a cousin who got divorced, this kind of thing, or is thinking about divorce. But the first way that I started to do this research was actually the work that my body and my face do. I don't look Japanese, I am not Japanese. And so a lot of people in a very friendly way were like, what are you doing here? Like, what, are you a student? What's going on? And again, very friendly, very welcoming, just genuinely curious, like, and what are you doing here? So I could use that as an opportunity to say, well, I know it's really strange, but I'm doing this project about divorce. Actually, later, I slightly shifted the way I introduced the project. I started to call it kazoku mondai, so family issues or family problems, because I found that a little bit more of a general topic gave more people sort of an excuse, an opportunity to respond and to feel like they want to say something about it. So that's how I started it. And that got me some good perspectives. And what was nice about that, what was productive about that, is I got people who weren't the divorce themselves and weren't really necessarily even thinking about it, but I got their sense of, oh, wait, I just watched this drama and I think it's important, you should watch it because, right? So I got the kind of ambient sort of general chatter. And then I was really grateful to be admitted into a kind of a substantial network of support groups. So I ended up spending a lot of time in my research in 5 different support groups, but one relatively famous counselor let me in, and I unfortunately I can't thank her by name because I need to keep her anonymous. But she let me in. I cold called her. Basically, I emailed her, and she let me have a meeting with her. And in the meeting, she said, research is really important. I like research. And I said, I like research too. So she let me join her group, basically, her multiple groups, which I should say I did pay for. So I spent a good portion of my research funds on support groups, and they were incredibly helpful. So there's sort of 2 different ways, right, where I had this kind of general, everybody knows what I'm doing and what I'm looking for. And then more specifically targeting people who are really focused on processing through family issues. Yeah.
So I'm curious, has she had a chance, this famous counselor, has she had a chance to read your book?
She hasn't yet, because actually she closed the center. And I can't find her mailing address at this point. So it got returned. So I have to figure this out.
Okay.
I hope I'm not saying too much that can be Googled. I guess in some ways it makes it easier because now the center where I did a good portion of my research does not exist.
Right.
So yeah. So the answer is no, unfortunately not yet. And because of COVID, of course I was going to go to Japan this summer with like a suitcase full of books to hand them out to people who helped me during the course of the research, but I wasn't able to do that, which is, I think, probably for me, one of the biggest losses in COVID, which of course tells you a lot about my privilege. But it's true, I was really looking forward. Maybe I can take this opportunity to say that there is a Japanese translation of the book coming out. A wonderful scholar named Takeshi Hamano is working on the translation, and it will be published in Japanese, hopefully maybe by the end of this summer. And so I hope that, I'm extremely grateful and excited about that. And I'm also hoping that that means that the vast majority of people with whom I do the research, of course, don't speak or read English. So this way they could actually get more of a sense in Japanese, right? And make it a little easier for them to read.
Right. Yeah. I'm really curious in thinking about divorce in particular. There are moments when you're hearing divorce stories where it isn't necessarily clear what someone's background might be, right? Like you could hear a divorce story, and there are particular moments in divorce stories where they could be French, they could be from Papua New Guinea, they could be from Japan. And I'm curious about when in your own research did Japaneseness really become relevant? When was it really foregrounded for you?
Yeah, it's such a good question. And you're absolutely right. I mean, just to jump a little bit backwards,
Yeah,
I remember doing the field work and being on what I guess then was what was pre-Zoom called Skype? Is that
yeah.
right? Okay. Skype call with one of my college roommates who's American and was in the US and was going through a breakup at the time. And I remember thinking, oh God, all my worlds are collapsing in on themselves, right? Like listening to her talk through this breakup in Chicago, and it reminded me a lot in certain ways of what I was seeing in my field work. So one way that we might notice Japanese divorce as Japanese is the way that law and legal norms and legal expectations play into people's decision making, especially around for parents who are getting divorced and have children, young children. So I'm sure that many people in this audience already know this, but there is no joint custody. There's no legal joint custody in Japan. So if you get divorced, the law will not expect you or ask you, or frankly, even accept the existence of shared custody. And I'll link back to this in a second. But so what this means is, not quite, that's not quite the way to say it, but many people, especially in divorces that were happening in the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s, there was a recognizable cultural norm to do what I call a clean break. So that means that many people, not all people, but many people believe that one of the best ways to handle the difficulties after divorce that a child would face is to make a clean break between that child and their non-custodial parent. So even to this day, a significant, not a majority, but a significant minority of Japanese children of divorced parents lose contact, intentionally have the contact broken between them and their non-custodial parent. And let me just be clear here. The logic is that it's really hard for children to handle divorce when their parents get divorced. And I think we can all probably recognize that, right? At the same time that we can recognize that some divorces are wonderful things that save people, like literally save people, right? And so Americans in general, at this moment in time, for instance, have a sort of different model. We say, okay, it's really hard, but we believe that it's better for children to stay in contact with both of their parents. And so therefore, we're going to do the hard work of negotiating those relationships, right? So I don't know, I imagine that lots of people in the audience either had this experience themselves growing up or know someone who did, right? Where you spend one weekend at one parent's house, or Tuesdays and Thursdays at your dad's, and Wednesdays and Fridays at your mom's, and then every other week. Like there's a lot of logistics in these models. That I think Americans tend to prefer, or to tend to think is a good idea. Like that hassle is worth it for Americans. In this Japanese model, which again, not everybody holds on to, but it is at least recognizable. Basically, people are believing the opposite. They're saying it's really, really hard for a child to lose contact with their non-custodial parent, but ultimately it's worth it because it makes it easier for the kid as they grow up. They don't have to be doing all this negotiation. They don't have to be doing, oh God, what day is it? Oh, last week I was at my dad's, so this week I'll be at my mom's. And also, frankly, when people talk about this, they say that also means that you don't have to see your parents fighting anymore, right? So that the logic is, you don't have to agree with the logic, but the logic is that having a clean break between child and the non-custodial parent means that the child is basically saved from a lot of conflict, right? And one of the things I found in my research was that at least a third of divorced parents are still maintaining contact with the non-custodial parent. So they're ignoring the law. It's not illegal, of course, right? They're just doing what they think is most important, and they're making sure that the kid sees both their parents, and they figure out some relationship, and they figure out some way to do it. And so it does happen. And one of the things I think my book is really contributing is making it clear that this does happen. Because if you look at the law, you wouldn't necessarily see that, right? You have to look at how people are actually living their lives. Alana, I just saw someone go by in your background. That's great.
Yeah, I'm proof that there has not been a divorce in this house during the pandemic.
I wish I had a pet that I could share with you right now, but I don't. So you know, that's something that feels, I'm sorry, this is kind of a long answer, but that's something that feels really Japanese. And that's something that when other people who aren't familiar with Japanese practices or Japanese cultural norms learn about, they're like, wait, what? You know, but it is something that really makes a difference. And so even if people decide that parents decide that they want to keep the relationship, you know, between both parents and the kid going, that cultural norm is still one, it's recognizable, and it's something that they have to kind of push back against. And I should say too, actually, right now there are a bunch of different sort of committees in the Ministry of Justice in Japan reevaluating the prohibition against joint custody. So it is something that in the next couple of years, I don't want to say I expect it to change, but I wouldn't be fully surprised if it changed. Yeah.
So I'm curious, as a kind of follow-up question, what are the gender implications of this? Like how does this play out in terms of people's gender roles?
Do you mean divorce in general, or do you mean custody in particular?
I mean the the non-joint custody aspect of this divorce, there must be some gender implications to it.
Yes, indeed there are.
Yes.
So the short answer is, at this moment in time, about 80% of custody is awarded to mothers. So the vast majority of custody is awarded to mothers. This is a relatively new thing. As recently as the 1950s, so in the immediate post-war, more custody, the majority of custody, I think something like 75% was awarded to fathers. So I think what we see here, so it's like a perfect flip, right, since the post-war. And I think what we're seeing in that is, first of all, the nuclearization of the family, so that I strongly suspect many of the fathers who were given legal custody, say in 1955, that child would actually be raised within a more extended family, right? So it wasn't like that father was taking care of the kid and making breakfast and making dinner, probably. And so we're seeing the nuclearization of the family now, and also a stronger legal preference or belief that mothers should be responsible, perhaps should be or are responsible for childcare and that kind of stuff, right? This is an incredibly contentious issue. There are fathers and grandparents and other family members literally protesting this because on the face of it, it's so obviously a gender disparity, right? And lots of fathers now understand themselves to be, and have been working hard to be, a really involved father. So the phrase is a little passé now, but there's a term in Japanese to mean like a father who's especially involved with their child. And you know, the measure for what involvement means is a little bit flexible. But for a father who has tried to be involved and, you know, isn't a workaholic and is coming home and hanging out with the kid, to then lose their child is deeply traumatizing, right? It's a really terrible situation. So on the face of it, it looks like women as mothers basically are benefiting from this really dramatically. The other thing to say is that a huge percentage of single mothers in Japan live basically below the poverty line. So if women are, quote unquote, winning custody, they're also winning a lot of cost, like the financial cost of divorce, especially for single mothers, single fathers to some degree as well, but single mothers, because of the gendered nature of the labor market in Japan, and basically how hard it is for women, especially women over the age of 35, to get a job that pays enough, but is also flexible enough for them to take care of their children, right? Pick their kid up after school. It's really hard. So the gender implications are rampant throughout this, but especially in terms of custody.
Right. Yeah. So I want to change tact a little bit. I know that for people who haven't studied breakups and divorce, this may seem like a strange question, but I think both of our works had moments of such joy especially in writing about it. And I'm wondering if you had a story in that just made you giddily happy to write and that you weren't willing to let it go come hell or high water. Like it was going to be in the book no matter what.
Yeah, you're right. And so let me answer generally first. I think that um, I don't want to trigger anybody. I don't want to upset anybody in the audience too much, but like some breakups are wonderful things, you know, like divorces can save lives and divorces can help people become free. Divorce, I mean, we don't even have to start thinking about things like domestic violence, right, and abuse within the home. So there are really giddy moments, certainly in field work. Um, and I think it's such a good question. I think my answer might be, I don't know if it's quite giddy, but it felt truly joyful to me. The moment that ends the book, actually. So it's not exactly a spoiler. I feel like I have to give a bit of a spoiler alert here, but you know, the book ends with I was leaving Japan from finishing this period of field work, and I had spent, you know, a year with people and a particular cohort of people, most of whom were women, but not all. I became really close with who were going to regular events at this particular counseling center that I went to. And one woman was part of the group and she was really nice and she was always really friendly, but she was really quiet and she never talked about herself. So, you know, in group work, you could always pass, and she sort of always did. And I remember at one time we went on a kind of weekend retreat together as a group, and she and I were assigned to be roommates. And I thought beforehand, I was like, good Lord, what are we going to talk about? Like she doesn't say anything. I realized later too, for whatever it's worth, that she had lived in the US for some years. And so I think she was genuinely very worried that I would make her speak English, which I was never going to do. So I think that might have been something going on too. But anyway, so right as I'm about to finish this fieldwork project, these very kind people invited me over for dinner as a sort of goodbye dinner. And I showed up at the door and I'm worried about like packing and I'm like shipping things across the ocean and I've, you know, got all my own problems in my head. And the hostess opens the door and she's like, did you read it? Did you know? And I was like, what's going on? What's going on? And what had happened was that day, that woman, the quiet woman, and I would say her name, except I forget the pretend name I gave her in the book. So I apologize. I'll just call her the quiet woman. The quiet woman had suddenly decided that today was the end of it for her and she was done. And so she wrote to this listserv that we all subscribed to. And she finally told us what she had been dealing with for like 20 years. And she had, you know, I don't need to get into it maybe here, but, you know, her husband was abusive and over the years and was having affairs and was like bringing his girlfriend home and just terrible stuff. And suddenly that morning, she just like didn't care anymore. She couldn't deal with it anymore. She changed the locks and she went to work. She changed the locks. She typed this then I hadn't read because I was packing. And this was before we had email on our phones. And then she went to work. So this dinner for me, that was supposed to be a goodbye dinner for me, became this celebration for her, basically, which is not quite giddy, but it was really amazing. It makes me emotional now to think about it. I mean, like she saved herself, you know, like she finally, I don't mean finally in an insulting way, but like she got together and did what she needed to do, this thing that felt impossible for 20 years, you know, with someone who's like hurting her, right, you know, causing violence, and she figured it out and she changed the locks. And so it became this really incredible evening where, because she was working until, I want to say something late, like 8 or 9, she wouldn't be able to get to dinner until later. So the rest of the group was there. And first they just told me the story, is like, you know, from all angles, this incredible narrative of what was going on. And then we had to wait for like 2 hours before she came. And so it became a moment when everyone kind of went around and reflected on their own version of the story, like when they finally had enough and what happened. So in some ways it was really emotional and really sad. And in other ways it was really exciting that, you know, she has the rest of her life now, that she knows that she did something that her husband specifically had told her she would never be able to do. So I don't know if that's quite giddy, Alana, but it felt really incredible to live through. And I tried to do it justice when I wrote it.
And was this, and I'm wondering, was this common in your divorce narratives that you were collecting, that there was a moment, that there was this kind of something would happen either internally or externally that would just be the moment of decision?
That's such a good question. It was for some people, but it wasn't everybody.
Right.
So one of the things I did that is actually completely invisible in the book, I never wrote about this, was I got graph paper, and and every time I did an interview, I asked someone to graph out the key moments of like realization or transition, like, and I didn't build a graph, like it was a blank piece of paper so they could graph however they wanted. And that helped me. I thought it might be interesting to see what people said, right? And then I could ask them about the points of inflection. So some people had, I'm thinking of a situation where, who's a woman who's not in the book actually, who told me that the night before, literally the night before her marriage, her wedding, she found out something terrible. I feel like that her husband, her boyfriend, her fiance had been cheating on her. Something really bad became clear. And she's like, okay, well, I have to go through with this. And so there was like this huge spike, but then she pulled it back down, and then a slow build, right? So I think one of the things that's, certainly from your own research too, but that's important to say is the way that people talk about a breakup and the way that people go through a breakup are different,
Right.
right? So that moment of inflection, yes, absolutely, because we need reasons, right? I mean, we humans need reasons. So when someone asks you, why did you break up? What happened? You have to have a reason. You can't just be like, well, like you need to have some way of narrativizing that. And so naturally people figure out excuses or explanations or whatever they need to sort of get through those like really awkward and difficult moments, right? Where someone's saying, what happened to your marriage? So people do talk about them, and they certainly have reasons or explanations like at hand. But then when you start to go into the research and start to talk to them more and have longer conversations in many different contexts, then it becomes clear that of course it's much more complicated than that. But I'd say the very small majority of people have a moment like that, right? Where it's like, absolutely. And to be clear, this is now what, 10 years ago that day happened. And if we asked her today what happened, she might tell a different story, right? Because it's about when you talk to someone. So in the book, I say I'm dealing with what I call retrospective reimaginings of people's relationships, right? Because I'm not sitting next to them the whole time, right? Like I'm getting their sense of what their relationship was like, and therefore how they decided to end it.
Right. Right. And the graph question that like the graphs that you collected makes people wonder, are there more aspects like this? Is there a detail that you worked very, very hard to collect and then just didn't end up featuring in the book?
Yeah, there are a lot, aren't there? Like, so
Sometimes, yes.
it's so hard. And actually, Alana, I should give you credit for this. There was one moment where I was writing what is now chapter 3, which is the legal chapter about the process of getting divorced. And I was saying, it's too long. Like, it's just too long. And I said something like, well, I have these 4 examples or 5 examples. And you said, why not just have 1 or 2, Allison? And I was like, oh my God, you're right. I don't have to include everybody I ever met who falls into this category. I could just have 1 or 2. So that made the book, I think, if the book is readable, it is because of advice like yours. Yeah, things that I left out. I worked really hard. There's this great guy I know I met, who is, at the time, he was probably about 70, maybe late 60s, and he had gotten divorced and remarried. Well, let me say, he got divorced and was a very sort of typical salary man. So that means he was relatively checked out from his family emotionally. And he was the way he was trying to be a good father and a good husband was by working really hard and making money and supporting them, which he did. And then in the 1990s, basically he and his wife got divorced, and he really amazingly like reinvented himself. He started going to a bunch of different counseling groups. He went back to college and took college courses in psychology. And he was this kind of like dreamboat in the counseling group, because there would be moments where we would have a party or something, and all the people in the kitchen preparing the food would be women, and then this guy. So he was like a complete dreamboat in that he was trying so hard to push back against these masculine norms that were entirely normal for his generation, for men in general maybe, but definitely for his generation. And everybody loved him. And then, of course, you probably can see where this is going. He did indeed get remarried to someone from the counseling group, right? because he was just so lovely. And so I worked really hard. He was one of the last people I pulled out of the book, because he's just such a great, lively person that I wanted to include him. But what I was saying about him was relatively redundant with other people that I represented in the book. So, but he's in there in one footnote. I say somewhere about a reading group I was part of. And he was the one who started the reading group because he wanted, the first book I remember we read was The Art of Loving. So he wanted to read these kinds of like popular psychology, like trying to figure out all this stuff. So he was just like a lifelong learner. So he's a great person. And I'm sorry that I didn't have enough space to include him. But thanks for the question. At least I can say it here.
So we're building up questions in the Q&A. And so I think I want to ask one last question and then open it up for other people. But I'm interested, like, this book has now been born. It is a circulating text. It is out there in the world. And I'm wondering, like, in a utopic space where you can give lots of book talks and have lots of conversations with people about it, and it has its own force in the world, what intervention would you like it to make? Like, what ideas from it now would you really like to travel and change people's minds?
Oh, that's such a nice question. Thank you for that. So I think I have a couple different answers. And the first is that, at least in the US, in English speaking media, Japanese intimacies, if we can call it that, sort of broadly speaking, are really horribly stereotyped. So a lot of common representations I'm talking about like CNN or BBC or pretty famously The New Yorker in this one article, represent Japanese intimate relationships as really weird, really irrational, like really dysfunctional. A phrase that I came up with that I'm still working on is that Japanese people in these representations are represented as sort of hypersexual virgins, meaning people who are having like all these weird desires and these weird intimacies, but don't actually ever really have, like, quote unquote, a real relationship. Of course, this is not true. Like, of course, we all know this is not true. But one of the things that I'm really sensitive to, and I think my undergraduate students especially have helped me feel this and notice this, is that, that's if you just consume American media about Japan, which is a reasonable thing to do, that's one of the images you come away with, is that these are kind of like freaky, weird people, especially around intimate issues. So if I can do anything generally to push back against that, I would be really happy about that, and I know that this book is not in that genre. It's not popular. So I don't know if the same people are going to pick it up. But I would be really happy to complicate people's understandings of sort of non-Japanese people's understandings of Japanese intimacies, so that they have like red flags that go off when you start hearing those kinds of things. To that end, I should say that the book is what's called open access. And I'm so thrilled. I'm so excited about this. And so what it means is that the University of Chicago Press, who published the book, and a program called Tome that's funded partially through the provost office actually at the University of Michigan, supported it, gave a subvention so that the book is published as a regular paperback book for, I think it's like $35 or $37. But then there's also this free open access PDF that is just around. Like, you can get it on Kindle, you can put it on your iPad. And I hope that means that maybe some more people might pick it up or read a couple paragraphs of it, right? You don't have to read the whole thing. So I want to say I'm very, very grateful to the Tome program for making the open access version possible. And I also wanted to give a specific shout out to a wonderful librarian, Meredith Kahn, here at the University of Michigan, who helped me navigate the process, because it's still relatively new to have open access monographs, books, I mean, as opposed to articles.
Yeah.
So in terms of interventions, that's one. I think I want to loop back to your first question, Alana, and say, like, I want more people to study divorce. Like, it's really interesting. Like, there's all this stuff going on. It's about money, but it's also about emotions, and it's about family, but it's, you know, it's just, it's really worth your time. So I'm hoping that this will contribute, as your work does, to anthropologists, especially spending a bit more time thinking about breakups and not just kinship.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think I think that we would really benefit from having as a subfield an anthropology of divorce and an anthropology of disconnection. That would that would be a true contribution to how we know what it means to be social in the world.
Yeah, I keep wanting to teach a class about breakups and divorce, but like, I feel like that would be popular. It would either be like awful or it would be really good. I talk a little bit about breakups in some of my classes, and students kind of like perk up, if that makes sense. So I think that might be interesting, but I haven't been able to get it on the schedule.
I teach a class on love and heartbreak.
I taught a class on love, and there was a section on heartbreak, but I was like, what if we did a whole class just about breakups and divorce?
I mean, imagine the soundtrack that you could have for the entire class.
Imagine the final projects. Like, what would they do? Yeah.
So, so there's a question that is actually a kind of nice follow-up from what you said you would like as your intervention, to be Arena's question. She's thanking you for an amazing talk. And she says, from what I know, I think of this as the otaku culture, is something that is really affecting the quality of romantic relationships in modern Japan. And she's wondering if there's any connection between this and divorce.
Yeah. So otaku culture is certainly a thing. And the word she uses is hikikomori. So for
Yeah.
people who don't know what that means, it's people who probably have what we would think of as extreme social anxiety, right? So that means these are people who like don't leave maybe their bedroom or don't leave their house or have agoraphobia, right? They don't want to be around other people. So it's a good question. And I'm sure that let's say, collection of social anxieties certainly deeply impact how those particular people have or don't have intimate relationships. But in terms of, I read a little bit about this in an co-edited volume called Intimate Japan. I think that there is a way that using that kind of character to stand in for all of Japan or all of Japanese people, which I understand, Arena, you're not doing. Like, I don't think, but some people do, right? And I think that's a big mistake, right? So the discourse in the US about what this type of person says about Japan is one thing, but there's also, of course, discourse in Japan about what does this say about ourselves as Japanese, specifically often in terms of masculinity, right? So many people, I'd say most people who are hikikomori are also men or young men. And so it kind of becomes a referendum on masculinity, where younger men who might have a different model for masculinity, right, or want to be men in different ways, are getting condemned, basically, right, because they don't want to overwork, because they don't want to become salarymen, because they don't want to get married and have kids and live that kind of life. So I think in some way they are certainly real people, right? But if sort of hikikomori or otaku type characters, how they're playing out, I think it's more at a discursive level than than anything I saw in my research. Like I can say clearly, this was not something that any real person thinking through divorce was seriously thinking about. But as a media image in Japan as well as in the US, right? And of course it takes on a different valence in Japan. It was certainly prevalent. And there are lots of conversations about gender norms, right? If anybody's interested, there's a really wonderful anthropologist named Emma Cook, who wrote a book about masculinities, youth masculinities, forgetting the title right now, but maybe Robin can find it and drop it into the chat. And one of the things she finds is that frita men, so these are men who are not working in normal sort of 9-to-5 white collar or blue collar jobs. Many of the men, young men with whom she did research, say that they want to be sort of like fancy free and have this new kind of masculinity, but then they want a very traditional wife, right? And as a reader, you're like, bro, like you got to pick one or the other, right? But I think lots of people do that. So lots of people have flexible understandings of norms that as they apply to them, but then are like, well, but I need my man to be taller than me, or, oh, but I need my man to make more money than me. Oh, but I need, right? So, and this is not unique to Japan. So in that way, the gap between how norms are changing when we think about it for ourselves versus when we think about it for our romantic partners is kind of interesting.
Right. So I wanted to kind of ask Michael Fetter's question. He has this kind of interesting question about saying that his sense is that the legal system unfairly affects the interests of women in Japan. And he was wondering what you thought about this, both for women working as housewives as well as for career women.
Yes. So it's a great question. Thank you. Thank you, Mike, for asking it. I don't know if maybe you can type this as an answer, but I'm not quite sure what you mean by unfairly affects. So is the legal system unfair? Yes. And I don't mean to laugh while I say that, but it's like, yes, absolutely. But it also, and I'm not sure if this is what you're implying or not, so I'll try to answer it in a few different directions. Japanese women are given, in general, women in Japan are given custody of their children more than men to an extraordinary degree, right? At this point, like basically 80-20. If you can't negotiate it on your own and you have to go to court, the court is much, much more likely to give custody to children. By that measure, absolutely, women are coming out on top, as it were. But by other measures, for instance, the court's willingness or ability to maintain child support payments, right? Then the women are not coming out on top, right? So in that same negotiation, a husband or a soon-to-be ex-husband can promise that he will pay a regular annual monthly, child support or alimony, and then just not pay it with almost no punishment at this point, right? They can't be held in contempt of court or something like that. So I personally do not think that the court system is unilaterally, categorically better for women in Japan. I think it's bad for everybody, actually. And I think it's in terms of family court stuff, right? Which is where I focus. And at the same time that I think some people are trying really hard to do the right thing and to try to figure out what would be the best for children in general or a child in a specific case. So this has become, child custody in general, as I imagine is one of the sort of key topics in the men's rights movement in the UK, in the US, and also increasingly in Japan. So that's important to say. At the same time that the court system in general is not, to my understanding, like unilaterally good for women or better for women. And there is lots of debate and a lot of controversy in Japan around these issues in particular.
Yeah, and Mike clarified that he was thinking about this as economic, in particular, that it was about no alimony payment.
Yes. Okay. Sorry. So yeah, that's the second half of it. Thanks, Mike. I'm sorry. I wasn't following the chat well. Yeah. So in Japan, you can basically be promised a child custody or alimony payments and then not get them. And there's very little recourse. I'm sorry, let me say this more carefully. There's very little formal recourse. There's actually a lot of informal recourse, right? So you can basically peer pressure your ex-husband. And I say this because this is what people do, right? So you can't go to the court and say, my ex-husband promised alimony payments and he's not giving them, help me. But you can go to your ex-husband's brother and say, look, come on, you got to help, get your brother to help. He's not doing his share, right? So people are really creative and clever. I'm not saying that should be the case. I'm just saying it is. And this is what my current research, the book that I'm writing now this semester, is about parental abduction. So when a parent takes their own child and prevents access to the other parent. So really contentious family law issues that are happening in Japan and also internationally to Japan. And so then these kinds of mechanisms, sort of the gap between what you can accomplish formally in law and what you can accomplish informally through all these other networks is even more clear. Mike, thank you for the questions and thank you for clarifying. That's so nice of you.
So I want to ask a follow-up question that is in the chat from Alexander, who's at University of Oxford, and he was wondering whether there was a changing pattern between the ratio of relatively bureaucratically easy divorces that were happening versus the ones that had to go through the courts, and how were couples negotiating the process of divorce in the legal and bureaucratic sense. And you have a lovely chapter on this, so I thought this was a perfect question for you to be engaging with.
Thank you. Yes, and thank you, Alexander, for your question and for being here all the way from Oxford. So yes, so broadly speaking, the vast majority of divorces in Japan are accomplished with relative bureaucratic ease. And by that, and please notice I'm saying bureaucratic. What this means is that if I want to get divorced, I pick up a form that's a very pretty simple form, like 2-page form. I fill it out, my husband fills it out, we both sign it, we both stamp it with our name stamps, and then somebody turns it in to the local government office. We don't both have to go. So it could be a third party. Somehow the form goes to the office. And that is the way that the majority of divorces in Japan are accomplished. Right now, it's about, I think, 87% of divorces are accomplished this way. Let me be really clear and say, this is not easy, right? This is just bureaucratically easy. So that means that all of that negotiation is getting pushed into sort of private spaces, right? And Alexander's question is actually about the other percentage. So right now, so if that doesn't work, if I want to get divorced, but say, for instance, my husband won't agree, right? He won't sign his name. And I, use all the mechanisms I can to try to get him to agree, and he won't. We go into a chote, so a negotiated or mediated divorce. And this is a situation where there are two counselors, and they are not actually trained as counselors. They're usually senior members of the community, sort of upstanding members of the community, who are one man and one woman, who are designed to help a couple negotiate a mutual decision, a decision either to get married, to stay married, or to get divorced, right? To get the people to agree. Most of the time, there's not a judge involved. There's a judge overseeing it, but that's not like the judge is, it's not happening in a courtroom space. It's happening in a kind of office, conference room space. So over the last 20 years, that type of mediated divorce has become slightly more common, slightly more frequent. But most of the time, most of this is triggered actually by the presence of children. This is now parents who are getting divorced, parents of young children who are getting divorced, are being pushed into these mediations, so that it's probable that the reason that the numbers are increasing are actually just because more parents, relative to the past, more parents are getting divorced this way. So it's still relatively, simple on paper to get divorced in Japan. And part of what I'm trying to do in the book is show how hard, or maybe not even how hard, but just like the detail of the process that's necessary because the law is set up the way it is. And so what does it take to do this negotiation on your own outside of the legal system? So thanks for the question, Alexander.
Yeah. And so there's another question that speaks to another chapter in your book by Minerva, where she is wondering if you could say a bit more about the generational gap that involved in expressing people's feelings as the younger generation becomes more and more comfortable saying I love you than previous ones. And if you could talk about a little bit about kind of how new generations are expressing their emotions more openly, if you think it's the case, and what is the shift that's happening in the ways in which people are understanding the conversation that is supposed to go along with companionate marriage, right?
Yeah, Minerva, thank you. Thank you for being here. And thanks for reading it. I really appreciate it. It's still kind of miraculous anytime anyone says they've read it. So yeah, there is a really big generational difference. But I want to be clear, and Minerva, you're not implying this in your question. I just want to say to everyone else, I'm not saying like older people did something one way and younger people are doing it. It's always a kind of mix and match. And I was thinking that, we all in our own ways think about our parents' marriage or our parents' relationships, our grandparents' marriages, and saying, oh, that's lovely, or oh, that I don't want that part, right? So this is happening, I think, for all people everywhere, as we're watching people around us be in relationships and using that as a kind of measure just to decide what we want. And then once you decide what you want, you actually have to go out and get it in the world, which turns out to be or make it in the world, which turns out to be a whole nother problem. But in terms of saying I love you, this is something that was really puzzling to me for a good number of months during my fieldwork. Was I would go to these events. So I'd go to big public talks about like how to save your marriage, or these counseling groups that I participated in. And one of the things that people would say is, to save your marriage, you need to say I love you. And I was like, okay, like I don't disagree, but it was being presented as this like silver bullet, like this was the way to save your marriage. And it took me a long time to understand what was going on. And basically what I came to understand and narrate in the book is that the I love you part was part of it, but it was actually more important to say it. Like what was being presented as a silver bullet was that you had to love your spouse enough that you loved them, right? That you could say, honestly, I love you. But then you also had to be able to say it and need to say it. And this is in distinction to sort of older generational models where you were supposed to be able to kind of, like a truly loving couple would read each other's minds, right? So have ishin, so like telepathic communication. And that was a model. And I think we all probably have these kinds of relationships in our lives where you're like, oh, he's sleepy or she's grouchy because she's hungry, right? Like you can kind of read people's minds. But for older generations and people now who are sort of grandparents age, basically, that was a model that was really recognizable. And so the reason that saying I love you was being presented in the early 2000s as a silver bullet was because it was refusing that generational difference, right? Or refusing that generational model and saying, no, telepathic communication is not a solution, right? Like you have to say it out loud. You have to need to say it out loud. And we have to understand ourselves, two people in a couple, as separate enough that we have to articulate these feelings. So let me look back at your question, Minerva, and make sure. I think I answered it. How new generations express their emotions more openly, if you think that's the case. I don't know if I want to say more openly, because I would say differently. People are expressing their emotions differently. But when I bring this example up with my students in class, like there's a whole range of variety in among my students, right? So some of whom are American, but not all of whom, certainly. And so it's really, there's not a clear generational divide. And like, I can't even tell you the number of truly hilarious stories I have been told about the first time a boyfriend or girlfriend says, I love you, and then the other one doesn't know how to respond, maybe because they were raised in a family that doesn't say I love you that much. But so the best one I can think of is someone who said, the boyfriend says, I love you for the first time. And the girl says, thank you, and shuts the car door and leaves. So like these kinds of stories, there's not a clear divide. So I hope I've tried to answer, I hope I've answered your question a bit, Minerva.
Right. So there's, there are two or three questions in the chat about whether divorce affects people's sense of losing face, whether it is stigmatized, and how did that play out in your fieldwork?
The short answer is yes. Divorce is absolutely stigmatized, and it's stigmatized differently than it used to be, basically. So one thing that I found, and I was genuinely surprised by, was that at the moment I was doing research, being divorced was maybe less stigmatizing than being never married after a certain age. So I figured this out in a moment when a friend of mine was getting set up with a guy, and I was trying to be supportive, as you do. And I was like, oh, he seems nice. You know, we hadn't met him yet. And she said, I think he was like 40 and never married. And she said, I'd rather he be divorced than never married at 40. I'm not saying that we should agree with her. I'm just saying that she presented it this way. And I remember thinking, oh my God, okay. And so I think that there's a lot of stigma around divorce, and a lot of people feel, I think not just in Japan, right? Like feel shame and feel like they need to explain themselves, and that it challenges their sense of self. And also there is a lot of stigma about people who are never married, so-called never marrieds, which is a hugely booming population in Japan, right? Like this is quite common. And let me be clear, I am not trying to say that there's anything wrong with it, either divorced or never being married. But so what I'm trying to say is that the conversation around divorce stigma is still there. And certainly people who are, I think, older feel it, and maybe exert it on other people, but it's not the only stigma. It's not the only stigmatized choice among the sort of dating and intimacy menu. At the same time, I want to say I was doing interviews with people who, I think probably the oldest she was in her late 80s. And in something like 1972, her husband had asked for a divorce, which she refused. And she refused it because of the stigma. She knew, or she felt sure, that her children would not be able to get married if they got divorced, because that would just make it impossible. So they stayed together. And then finally, something in like 1997, she agreed to the divorce. And he had been living for those 20 years with another woman and having children with her. And so sort of everybody knew. But what I'm trying to say is I did manage to capture in my project people who had made big life choices differently precisely because of the stigma of divorce.
And so there's a question also in the chat about what role divorce has had on Japan's birth rate issues, and if you know anything about that. And is also thanking you for making it open access. Which...
Oh, thanks. Thank you. Thank you for that. I really appreciate it. Yeah. So divorce on Japan's birth rate issues. Yeah. So Japan's birth rate issues are legion, right? Yep. And the birth rate is pretty low and doesn't seem to be going anywhere, and doesn't seem to be getting any higher. I think that there's not, to my mind at least, there's not like a direct correlation or causation, but there's something about, I want to say hi to David so badly, Alana.
Yes, no, I'm sorry, his hands are quite full. This is...
You know what'd be really funny? I'm just realizing now, we should have staged a pretend divorce behind you this whole time, so that like he's just like, I'm leaving.
David, Allison is saying hi.
Sorry, everyone. Okay, so the birth rate issue, you know, I don't think there's a direct correlation. I think all of this is a kind of cluster where people have different desires for family life, right? And I think for some people, I could easily imagine like the motivations they have for getting divorced have to be similar for the motivations they have for not having children or not having more children. Like that makes sense to me, right? If you're unhappy in a relationship, or you're worried about violence or something like that, of course you wouldn't want to stay married or something, or have more children. At the same time that I think the birth rate issue is so complicated. Well, I don't want to make, I mean, if they just started hiring women in jobs that would actually pay them and still give them time to be parents, I think that the birth rate issue might be solved. So let me just say that. But yeah, I think they're all sort of clustered together, but I don't think that there's a direct correlation.
Right. And there are a few questions in the chat about something that you probably can't answer because you couldn't do fieldwork, but about whether you have any sense of what's happening during the pandemic.
Yeah,
Mishiko is asking this, and I think there are one or two other questions. Like,
thank
is
you.
there a COVID divorce happening?
Yeah, so what I can say, I haven't been able to be in Japan for like 18 months now, which feels weird and awful. And so what I can say, and it sounds like you all are reading the same newspapers that I am, there is certainly attention to it, media, journalistic attention to it as a category. Um, I don't know. I don't know, because my first instinct, to be honest with you, is to say, like, if the media is interested in something, like, I'm going to take it with a big grain of salt. So I'm not sure. I'm not sure if it's true or not. I can also say that the ways in which COVID is forcing us to stay in families more, or stay in houses more often with family members, um, makes it what, ripe in a terrible way for violence and domestic violence. And I remember reading, I think this was actually about the UK and the Guardian, about how and trigger warning for people who are thinking about these topics, but um, the rates of reported child abuse are actually much lower this year than they were this time last year, or a year or two before that, which is quite worrisome. So meaning that people who um, we imagine that those experiences haven't changed. It's the reporting, right? And say teachers or other community members noticing or catching. So I think in that way there have to be things going on, but I hope this doesn't sound weaselly, but I just don't feel comfortable guessing, because it's usually so much more complicated than the kind of journalistic view. So on the one hand, I could also imagine people not wanting to get divorced if they're out of work, right? They can't afford to get divorced. It's really hard to move during COVID. Like, so all of the kind of logistical things.
No, Allison, it turns out people are moving left and
Okay.
right
Okay.
during COVID, much to my surprise.
Okay. My mistake. So, yeah, it's a good topic, but I don't know yet is really the genuine answer. But thank you for thinking about it.
Um, so let me see if I think we might have time for one more question. And I think I'm going to ask a question that leads into your next project, as far as I understand it, which is, have you been thinking about international marriages in Japan at all? Like when one of the spouses is not Japanese, and how that affects divorce and child custody issues.
Yes, I can. I think that we have a little more time than that, because I think we have like another 15 minutes or so.
Okay.
So unless you want me to answer this for 15 minutes, which I'm going to try not to do. Yeah, so international divorce you're absolutely right, is something that I'm focusing much more on. So um, the the common sort of stereotypes of international marriages, and by that I mean a marriage where one spouse is not Japanese, focuses on Japanese women marrying foreign men. And in practice, those are only about 25% of the relationships. The vast majority of so-called international marriages in Japan are between a Japanese man and a foreign woman. And they tend to be from Korea, China, and the Philippines. I think I'm getting that right. And there's a wonderful book by an anthropologist named Chigusa Yamaura. Robin, if you have time to find it, that'd be great. I have it on my shelf. It's called Marriage and Marriageability. I'm literally looking at it right now, just out of Cornell. And she's an amazing anthropologist, and she's working on dating companies basically that are hooking up usually rural farmers, Japanese farmers, who want to get married, maybe a little bit older, and they're marrying women from China. And so then dealing with the kind of the complications of those relationships. So when we think about the divorce, sort of famous or media divorces, they tend to be between Japanese women and foreign men. And my project, the book that I'm writing right now, is often about the way that the worst kinds of fallout for those relationships. And so, yeah, getting divorced from a foreigner, from what I've noticed, many foreigners and non-Japanese people are surprised by, or can be surprised by, the legal process in Japan. So the fact that It's a very simple form that you don't go before a judge. It always depends on what kinds of expectations the foreigner comes in with, right? But for an American, I think especially it can be kind of unusual because you don't have to get a lawyer, you don't have to be in front of a judge, you don't have to do these things. So it can happen in kind of private and informal ways. And so I think for some people that can be really difficult. And if you're interested, I have an article about this coming out of the journal Positions. I think it should be out by the end of the year. And it's about the gaps between and the tension caused by these different legal ideologies. So like if I expect law to act like a police officer, protecting me and saving me, versus someone who thinks like, oh, law is just like a tangle of mess, I don't want to go anywhere near it. There tend to be different sort of cultural norms around law. And so one of the things I'm trying to write about is basically when these people with these different ideologies get married, you don't really notice it, but when you get divorced, you really start to notice how they're reaching to law or refusing law in different ways. So thank you for that.
So I want to kind of ask Alexandra's question. She's wondering if you encountered issues related to LGBTQ issues. I guess she's asking, how straight is your book? And what is the kind of legal background in Japan, whether this was in relationship to being queer, and whether this was affecting your research in Japan at all?
Thank you for that question. Yes, absolutely. My book is pretty straight. So, I feel like that's fair to say. So it's accurate to say. In Japan right now, the only relationships or marriages, I should say, that are legally possible are between people of different genders, legal genders. So I'm trying to be very careful in my language here. Of course, this means that gay or queer or lesbian people get married, but that they get married, the marriage is with someone not of their gender, right? So there's all sorts of good research. I'm thinking of work in South Korea, especially in China, about queer people, gay people, lesbian people very intentionally marrying someone, say like a lesbian woman marrying a gay man, basically to get the family off their backs. Maybe they're not out to their family, right? And they're sort of a marriage of convenience, a very sort of strategic marriage. So those absolutely can happen in Japan. But legally speaking, gay people cannot be out as a gay marriage. Gay marriage is not legal in Japan. There is certainly activism around this. I hope it will change soon and that anybody who wants to get married can be legally married. So my book is focused on people who were in legal marriages and are therefore getting legally divorced. So none of the marriages in my book are LGBTQ, if we can call it that way. That doesn't mean that the people themselves aren't, right? People's sexuality and identifications change over the course of their lives. I can say that for whatever reason, either no one felt comfortable outing themselves to me. That again, doesn't mean that they do not identify that way, but that they did not tell me about that. The other thing I can say, and maybe I should have said this earlier, this is something that wasn't in the book, but was in the much earlier dissertation. I did try very hard to, when I was doing the research, to make it as less heteronormative if I possibly could. And so one of the things I did was go regularly to an LGBTQ rights group that I won't name, who were at the time advocating for gay marriage, right? So, and I was thinking, oh, this could be really interesting, right? If I've got all the straights or semi-straights, whatever we're going to call them, pseudo-straights, who are exiting marriage, and there's all these great gay and queer people, right, who are trying to get into it. So that would be a kind of interesting parallel. It was in some ways, but it didn't end up in the book. One of the things I found was that I remember this really distinct moment. I was at a presentation and a lesbian woman was talking about why she wanted to be able to get married. If this was live, I would ask you, what do you think it was? So please have an answer in your mind. The answer was she wanted a K-tie discount. She wanted a discount for her cell phone because they're family plans. And so if you're a family member, you can call each other, right, cheaper. And I thought, if that's not the best reason for marriage, I don't know what is, right? So, and she's absolutely right, because like there's all these ways, like this is heteronormativity in action. There's all these ways that you get acknowledged and you get rewarded and you literally save money. We're not even talking about the tax system. Like we can get into that. And so I completely understand why these activists would be focused on something that seems so small and is also so completely important. But yeah, I think that there's certainly, I think I say this in the book too, there's a great project for someone who wants to study breaking up, queer people breaking up, queer families breaking up in Japan, specifically because the law offers you practically nothing, like no help. So people have to negotiate it on their own. So if anybody's looking for a project, I think that would be a really great one.
So wonderful. There's another question that I would like to kind of ask that has come up in the chat. I think people were responding to the fact that I'd been asking you about things that had made you giddily happy to include. And they're wondering, was there any stories that you were really reluctant to include?
Yes, yes, there were. So I ended up including it in the last chapter, chapter 6, and I talk in that chapter about how hard it was to include. So don't brace yourselves. It's okay. It's not too bad. Basically, oh gosh, years ago when I was in Japan, I met a guy who I think Yoshida-san in the book. He was older, he was a salaryman and he was married, and we met at a party and whatever. We kind of became friends, and he wanted to learn English. So we would like talk in English for 10 minutes and then we would just like hang out and speak in Japanese, right? So, and he is very, very social, and he just likes like hooking people up in a friendly way, not in a dating way, but just like, oh, I remember one time he introduced me, he had a friend who worked at JICA, which is sort of a Japanese like big aid organization. And he's like, oh, you're an anthropologist and he lived in Kenya for years, so you guys are going to have a lot to talk about. And I was like, yeah, sure, I'll definitely talk to this gentleman who lived in Kenya for years. So just like that, just like really nice and social. Anyway, so when I started graduate school, my project was about the birth control pill in Japan, which had been legalized just in 1999 and was really unpopular. So this was probably like 2002, 2003, or maybe even earlier. And I was really interested in how the birth control pill was going to be marketed in Japan. Like, how are you going to make it popular? And you can probably see that this is about gender and this is about family. Like there's a thread. And so Yoshida-san
and declining birth rates.
And declining birth rate. Thank you very much. Yes, indeed. Absolutely. And Yoshida-san was super generous, and he's like, oh, well, I know a doctor, so we'll ask him to introduce you to a doctor who, so he was really being very generous and introducing me to people. And he had no interest. He has no business in, anything to do with birth control. I think he thought it was kind of hilarious to introduce me at parties, be like, you think she's weird? Let me tell you how weird she is. Right. So, which makes sense. That's fair. And then that project kind of went nowhere because nobody is using the pill. So I think it's like 3% of women in Japan who use birth control use oral contraceptives. And I was doing all these preliminary interviews, and I finally realized that I could change the project in a serious way, but I couldn't do an ethnographic project about a complete absence of interest in something. So I was going to have to do the project in like a boardroom with like pharmaceutical executives or something. And I was like, no, thank you, please. And at that moment, maybe this is a happy story for graduate students, because it's like, at the depth of my despair, where I'm like, well, there goes, my project has just fallen apart in my hands. I had a friend who said, in this very offhand way, she's like, everybody's getting divorced. All my friends are getting divorced. And I was like, huh. And what's crazy is, I think she said that to me in 2002. And if you look back, the post-war spike in the divorce rate is 2003. Like, she was so right. It was unbelievable. And so I listened to her, and I believed her, and I started asking people. So I switched my project. And then I came back. So that was during a school year. So I was in the US. And then I came back in the summer, and I met up with this guy again, and we had, whatever, coffee or dinner. And I said, oh, by the way, I've changed my project to be about divorce. And I still remember, and he just like, he just like fell, he just melted down. And I was like, oh
Mm.
God, what did I say? And so what had happened in that 9 months was that his wife had asked for a divorce. And it was awful. Like I felt awful. I feel awful now. I accidentally like just like poked him in like the worst possible way. And so we were already pretty good friends and we already hung out a bunch. But then when people asked about my research, it was awful for him. And I would try to change the subject. And, so I was accidentally very close, like geographically, emotionally close, physically close to this person who was going through this horrible thing. And I should be really clear, he didn't want the divorce. She wanted it, conforming to these stereotypes. He was actually working to push against it. They went into the cholte, they went into the mediation. He said no. And then the mediation was so awful that he eventually was just like, screw it, I'm done. Okay, fine, I'll agree. And so that was really hard. It gave me a lot of insight. I got a lot of perspective from being his friend, but I felt terrible for him. He's fine, I should say, he's fine, but like I felt terrible for him. And I didn't want to exploit it. I didn't want to use it. He wasn't a research subject or whatever, an interlocutor, whatever word we want to use. He was a guy living his life who, as a punishment, as a reward for being nice to a random foreigner, gets this goofball now studying like his worst nightmare, basically. So that was hard. And I have a couple short sections about that, but like basically the whole book could have been him if I wanted it to be. But I didn't feel comfortable doing that. And I should say, at no point am I ever, I'm everybody knows what I'm there to do. Does that make sense? Like I'm never not
Yeah.
disclosing. At the same time that I think for lots of people, you all probably realize, like, it just feels icky. Like I don't want to use his story without being really careful of it. So I've changed as much as I could. I think he can recognize himself in the book, but other people wouldn't be able to recognize him. So yeah. So he
Right.
occurs in chapter 6. Yeah.
So I'm interested in picking up on another aspect in your answer to this question, which is how do you choose projects now? And I'm wondering if we could kind of end on this note of you've spent so many years working on this book. Like it means that you are choosing a project that you too will, all of us are faced with this kind of, what is a project that we will spend so many years working on next? And so I'm wondering what are your personal insights or strategies for coming up with research projects?
Let me start by saying thank you for that question, Alana. I didn't intend to be working on this book as long as I did.
No, I didn't mean it that way.
Like, yeah, sure, that's fair question.
But we all, every time we have to choose a new research project, if we are anthropologists, we are committing to years.
Yeah, we are committing to years, and I'm fine with that.
Yeah.
How did I choose? So I'm not an activist, and I'm not trying to, I know there are wonderful scholars who are also activists, and I don't think I'm quite that. What I'm trying to do, by that I mean I'm not really making suggestions about like how to solve problems in the world explicitly in my work. But what I am trying to do is give enough what I'll call ethnographic detail, sort of like real life examples, so that people who are smarter and better trained than I am can propose potential answers to it. So the book I'm writing right now is about really terrible, abduction cases within families where kids are taken and stuck, and often lose contact with parents in really traumatic ways. And I don't think I'm going to offer, I haven't yet written this part, but I don't think I'm going to be offering like proposed solutions. But what I'm trying to do is give enough detail so that people who want to understand the situation to offer solutions, or to reduce the suffering in the world, we could put it that way, will be able to do that. And maybe it seems small, but as far as I know, as far as I can find, very few people who do research about divorce in Japan focus on the divorces that happen outside the legal system. So like this 87%. And so I think that I am making a real contribution to say like this is the work that it takes to get divorced in Japan because of the way the legal system is set up. I'm not trying to say it's good or bad, but like really when it plays out, this is what it looks like. So that's what I'm trying to do. So I don't feel like I'm just exposing people to terrible things. I should give Glenda Roberts a shout out, who's my mentor at Waseda. One time, I think it must have when I told her about my new project, she looked at me, she's like, you just choose the saddest topics. And I thought, you're not wrong, Glenda. So I'm not really trying to choose sad topics, but I am trying to make it, trying to reduce some of the pain and suffering that comes within these relationships. Thank you so much, Alana. This has been such a pleasure. Thank you everyone for being here.
Yeah, so thank you all of you for asking such imaginative questions. And Allison, thank you for producing such a lovely book. I am so happy to see it born in the world.
Oh, thank you.
And hopefully making the differences. May your words to God's ears, may it make the differences that you hope for it.
I hope so too. And thank you, Alana. I think if the book is born, you are certainly a doula. So thank you all for being here, and I look forward to seeing you at 7 p.m., not noon, next Thursday. Thank you, Alana. Thank you, everyone.